No, Rome did not invent Christianity. This idea is unanimously rejected by scholars.
And the penny dropped. The penny dropped that Jesus, as a human being, never existed.
The presentation of the Jesus character, it's somewhat of a composite of many messianic leaders of the time.
Well, let's just go back to the drawing board and we'll leave aside all of the assumptions of Christian history and let's just look at the text afresh and consider every possibility. Let's open the whole game up.
Can you think that Christianity is really paganism by a different name? Now it feels completely obvious.
Some of us are saying that this was a sun god turned into a Jewish man.
In all of this, we're dealing with literature. We're not dealing with history. So the answer is no, there is no history to this character of Jesus. It's entirely a literary creation.
Some of our Bible scholars are mavericks, working outside the restrictions of mainstream religious institutions. This allows them the freedom to provide fresh insights and draw some startling conclusions about how Christianity was formed.
Oops, it turns out it's not unanimous after all. Thank you for demonstrating that we cannot trust scholars with the truth.
This came from Joseph Atwell, who argued that after the Jewish War of 70 AD, Rome got Flavius Josephus to invent a religion for the Jews with a peaceful Messiah, so they wouldn't revolt again. There are so many problems with this theory.
The biggest problem is that scholars can't tell the difference between wartime propaganda and reliable history. Josephus was a Jewish general in the Jewish revolt until the Romans conquered Galilee. Josephus was allowed to live because he promised Vespasian that he could tell a story that would proclaim him as the Jewish Messiah. Vespasian was the head of the Flavian dynasty, which is why Josephus was later known as Flavius Josephus.
First, we have evidence of Christians from before this time period. Tacitus mentions that Nero was persecuting them. Suetonius mentions during the days of Claudius that the Jews in Rome were fighting over a Christus or a Christ figure.
The Romans were not persecuting Christians before the war. They were persecuting Jews. You can't believe everything you read. In fact, everything ever written has some bias associated with it, and it should be the job of scholars to identify that bias. And in this case, the Jews were the enemy of the Romans in the first century, not the Christians.
The Romans also utterly crushed the Jews in their revolt. They didn't have to try to make them more peaceful by inventing a religion. They were utterly defeated.
Utterly defeated? Then why was there another Jewish revolt 60 years later called the Bar Kokhba Revolt? Obviously, the Jews were not utterly defeated in the first Roman-Jewish war.
And why would Rome invent a religion that preached you should only worship one god and not sacrifice to other deities? It was essential to the Roman Empire to sacrifice to Caesar, which the early Christians refused.
There were no Christians before the war. There were only Jews who would not comply with the Roman demands, which is why there was a war between the Romans and the Jews. The Christian narrative is that those Jews that were being persecuted were Christians, but that is simply propaganda intended to generate sympathy for the new Greek and Roman religion that was developed after the war.
Why would you invent a religion that focused on converting the Gentiles, who were already good subjects and sacrificed to Caesar?
So you can't see why the Romans would write a story about the end of Judaism and why the Jewish God now sided with the entire Roman Empire.
So there's no reason to think Rome invented Christianity.
No reason? The Jews revolted against Rome in the first century, so the Romans defeated the Jews in many battles. Then they ended their religion, they destroyed their holy city and their temple, and they created a narrative that the Jewish Messiah already arrived, but the Jews rejected him. So that Jewish Messiah promised to return in the glory of his Father with his mighty angels for Judgment Day before that generation passed away. And so 40 years later, Titus returned in the glory of his Father with his mighty army to execute judgment on those who did not know the Roman god Vespasian.